Hello and welcome. Today we're going to do what I've always wanted to do with the Dungeon Tutor, and that is dissect and talk about role-playing games. And today we're going to start with probably the most well-known role-playing game of all time. I don't even think probably. It is the most well-known role-playing game of all time. I hope you brought your lunch because this one could be a little bit of a long one. Hello friends, I am the Dungeon Tutor. Welcome. Today we are going to be discussing a game that doesn't really need much introduction because more people know about this role-playing game than any other one in history. It is Dungeons & Dragons. Specifically, it is the 5th edition of the Dungeons & Dragons, which is, as of the moment of this video, the current edition. With rumblings of a new one coming up, this may change, but for the most part, they've warned that it's going to be compatible with 5th edition, so I think this will be valid for some time to come. You might ask yourself, why, Rob? Why, oh Dungeon Tutor, would you even cover Dungeons & Dragons when there are so many other games out there? And that is completely true and valid. However, I think it's important to set a baseline so that we have something to compare any other game against. And honestly, Dungeons & Dragons fits that bill pretty well. Many people are familiar with it, so if I talk about a game that holds up in some areas and are deficient in others for what you might want to do with the game, then if you play Dungeons & Dragons, you know this is something that I want. If it doesn't cover that, perhaps this is a game that I can pass on. Whereas if this game does something stronger than Dungeons & Dragons, and that's really what I'm looking for, maybe that's a game that I consider going after. So, let's talk Dungeons & Dragons, shall we? Now, Dungeons & Dragons itself has a long and storied history, all the way back 1974, created by Gary Gygax and David Arneson, their ideas mingling together, the wargaming aspect of Gary and the idea of individual adventure and daring do. They worked together to make Dungeons & Dragons. And while Mr. Arneson's contributions were mixed in and felt over a long period of time, Gary got most of the glory, and as a result, a lot of people still remember Gary pretty fondly as one of the grandfathers of role-playing games. Now, we're not talking about history. We're not going to do this. That's for another video. We're going to concentrate on the current product, because even though it says 5th edition, there have been at least 8, probably 9 editions of Dungeons & Dragons and many iterations on some of those editions, so we're just going to cover this. And there's more than enough to do. So, if you're coming in from the outside, you've probably heard about Dungeons & Dragons at least, but maybe you don't know it like I know it. I know it both having played it and run it. That Dungeons & Dragons is a class-based, level-based, middleweight rules, high fantasy role-playing game. All of those things have different meanings. All of them I will explain, but this will help to set up our baseline for explaining and talking about role-playing games in the future. So let's go. First of all, if you know anything about role-playing games, you know that the role means I have a character. I take on the guise of that character when I'm playing. But before that, role meant your job within the group. The part you played. Are you the healer? Are you the tank? Are you the damage dealer? Are you the controller? And all of those are still valid. Absolutely. In terms of classes, though, in Dungeons & Dragons, much like any other game, your class helps to guide you into one of those roles. Mostly by the flavor and tender of the abilities that you get for that class. If you're playing a cleric, it doesn't take very long looking over the spell selection, for instance, to figure out that your character has some unique abilities. Well, unique is a bit strong, but you have a lot of abilities that are oriented towards healing your party, towards supporting your party, debuffing your enemies, and some nice utility stuff. It is not a class that is packed with offensive magics, although there are certainly some iterations on the class that can do that quite well. But the focus is on support and healing for most of the abilities. And these are abilities, too, that most of the other classes don't do nearly as well. If you take a fighter, there's a class that is absolutely focused on being able to be survivable in a variety of combat situations, because a large portion of your responsibilities are going to be gathering the enemy's attention and stopping them from accessing freely your party that may really need a little space to do what they do well, or at least not die quickly. You are suited for taking punishment. You are suited for avoiding and mitigating damage by the armors that you can wear, by the abilities you may have. Even the ability to absorb damage and heal it on the fly. But as far as all the other things, controlling crowds and support of magic and effects, that's not what you do well. At least not by default. Obviously, you might be able to tinker under the hood and change some things, but for the most part, the classes guide you into what your role ultimately will be. There's a lot of ambiguity for some of the classes. For instance, if you're playing a wizard class, yes, you could be one of the game's most effective controllers, absolutely limiting access of some of your enemies to parts of the battlefield so that they can be more easily taken care of piecemeal, or completely possibly shutting them down as a sleep spell, for instance, taking them out of the fight, or creating zones where your enemies don't want to go by putting out a stinking cloud, for instance, that will debilitate them if they go through it. Wizards can be really good at those kind of things, but they can also be superlative damage dealers, which can be very effective. They can also buff their allies and cast spells that enhance what your other player characters already do really well. So there is flexibility in those classes. There are different ways of looking at them so that you can do multiple things, or you can focus on one thing and do it exceedingly well. Classes generally do this, and most of the classes by now are fairly iconic. Dungeons & Dragons, as the tentpole role-playing game, has those classes that have been with it for many years, as well as some new ones. Relatively new, I should say, because some of them, like, say, the Bard, have been with Dungeons & Dragons. In the current edition, second edition's Bard is kind of closer to the one that they have today. I know there's one in the appendix of the original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but still, yeah. It gets complicated if you want to go through the history of it, and again, we're not doing that here. But many of the classes speak to a particular play style. Your barbarians, for example, are superlative damage dealers, able to absorb a lot of punishment. Many of their triggered abilities help them to absolutely get the most they can out of a fight. And then after that, that's where most of their powers and abilities are. So everything else that you bring to the character is going to come off of secondary abilities, like the skills they know. And, you know, the background that they have that might also add some levels to them that might help out the party. But most of their class abilities are going to concentrate on doing, you know, the large amounts of damage in a swipe. And there's a lot that you can play around with in that. Also, Dungeons & Dragons allows multi-classing in the 5th edition, so if you want to mix up and take a few levels of Warlock with your Barbarian, which could be interesting, you have a class that, yeah, can still hit hard at close-up range, but if they can't get into close-up range, they can still zap opponents using Eldritch Blasts from their Warlock abilities, and that can make for very strong combinations. Part of the game for some people is absolutely coming out with the perfect combination that does exactly what you want to do with the class, and I'm not saying that's not valid. So there's classes to consider, of course. Also, level-based. Your character gets more powerful As you gather experience from your adventuring, from the fights that you have, accomplishing the missions that you do, you grow in power. And Dungeons and Dragons is all about that leveling. It is a regular hit of endorphins every time you see those numbers go up. Characters want to level. They want to be able to get bigger and more powerful so that they can take on tougher challenges. They can be rewarded more for the adventuring that they do. And that is a significant carrot held out in front of people playing the game. The opportunity to get stronger and more powerful because of your experiences. And that's measured by your level. The classic way of going up level is by experience, where you kill so many monsters or you accomplish so many things and get experience rewards for doing it that eventually you hit a benchmark and ding, your numbers go up, you roll for more hit points, so on and so forth. Some people use alternate systems, and the Dungeon Master's Guide has a variety of alternatives and options that can customize the game more so to the way you might want to play it, as opposed to absolutely vanilla by the rules as written, all capital letters on that, which is how you might play if, say, you're playing the official Adventurers League, where they have expressly certain rules that cannot be violated. But when you're playing at home with your friends, pick the rules that you like. It's certainly possible. But level-based means that all of your character's advancements, all of them, either come from your leveling up, which increases all your class benefits, which is basically the measuring stick. You generally don't get more powerful because of the species that you are or the background that you have. That's all built into your character already. It's the class that you have that determines what new powers and abilities you're going to get, how big of a die you're going to roll for the potential hit points that you could get. That's based on your class. And because you can multi-class, that can vary and swing wildly, depending on how you're interested in seeing your character grow and develop. So levels, very important. It especially is important if you are playing a game on some sort of a measured challenge, like if you're playing an adventure path. Then, oftentimes, the challenges scale upward as your characters increase in power. So you start out playing against goblins and orcs, and in the end, you're going up against dragons and liches. That's part of how the game works, and it's an important incentive for your characters to continually be fed a diet of advanced foes to make you feel stronger. The other way, of course, that you increase in power is by loot, mostly measured in magical items, because they unlock new abilities for you, and they are a measure of your progress. In 5th edition, magical items aren't quite as important as some of the earlier editions. 3rd edition, and even 4th edition had leaned a lot on having the multiple magical items to affect your character, many of which can only be used once a day. So it behooved you to have a stash in the end. But in 5th edition, having magical items is a tangible measure of your character getting more powerful. So it's a very popular loot to find among the triumphs and spoils of battle, or as a reward for accomplishing your missions. Sometimes as a sidebar. For example, if they engage in a little burglary, it might be rewarded by a magical item if you succeed. So the class-based and level-based is baked into Dungeons & Dragons. It's been hard-coded in since almost the beginning of the game, and it certainly is no less important now for letting your players feel a sense of accomplishment, a sense of growing power and determination, getting farther away from the weak days when they just stepped out of being apprentices and are now proper heroes. That being said, it's also a popular thing to be able to pick up and play at an advanced level so that you don't have to go through those apprentice issues. If you start out the game at, say, 5th level, your characters are already considerably more powerful than they would have been if they started at 1st, which is appropriate if you're telling a story in a more hostile or dangerous scenario. In which case, then, the characters are now powerful enough to challenge those stronger risks and take on higher-level foes. This is not a wrong way to play. It is certainly what some people enjoy doing. Some people do not like playing low levels, and some people really love it. So it's a little bit of everything for everybody. And that is, again, kind of important stuff. Now, when I say the game has middleweight rules, what do I mean by that? Well, there is a sliding scale of what is often called crunch. That is the complexity of the rules, the system which makes your game run. When one person talks about system, they're generally talking about the process used to determine if something succeeds or fails. Your system handles that. If I decide that I want to attack a foe, the system has steps by which I determine if I successfully hit or not. If I want to jump over a ravine, a system is in place where I can determine, do I succeed or not. And with Dungeons & Dragons, I say middleweight because it primarily has one system that covers almost everything. After all the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition is basically summed up by roll a 20-sided die, add any modifiers that would apply, compare it against a target number. In a fight, for instance, if you're swinging a sword, that 20-sided die might be added to your strength modifier. If you have a higher strength or a lower strength, a modifier might be applied. High strength will give a positive modifier. If you have a substandard strength, you might have a penalty. If you are skilled with using a sword, as any proper warrior would be, but maybe not so much a wizard, you would add your proficiency modifier to it in 5th edition, which goes up very slowly as you level up. It's never a huge number, so it's easy to add, but it does demonstrate how a character that is skilled is superior to one who is not. And by the time you advance in levels, you will see a bigger disparity between the haves and have-nots of proficiency. Then finally, sometimes there's miscellaneous modifiers. Oftentimes magic that you use will give a flat modifier. Like if you use a magical sword, the sword may have a bonus that you add to every hit that you make, and possibly to damage that you deal out. But it's middleweight in complexity, because that by itself is actually fairly easy to do, using that one system for everything. Saving throws, ability checks, attack rolls in combat. That's actually fairly simple. There are a few other systems in place, though. For instance, once you hit that foe, you take another die and you roll it for the damage that you do, which is completely unconnected with how good of a hit you did. If you hit, that means that you roll for damage and add any modifiers to that using a different die, a different system. So there are some things that do different mechanisms. Magic oftentimes, too, has different mechanisms that are employed. Do you roll to just straight roll damage and then your opponents roll to see if they avoid the worst of it with saving throws? Possibly. But it's also possible that you might just roll to attack a foe with a magical spell, and if it hits, it does full damage. It's a mixed bag because there are so many spells, many of them grandfathered from earlier editions, that in order to play a class that employs those abilities, you will want to learn the rules for your particular spells. It will be something that you will use, very likely, again and again, and therefore it's going to slow things down tremendously if you have to constantly keep looking things up. That's why those wonderful little cards that outline all of the different spells are so popular. Just simplifies everything, makes it easier for a person playing a spellcaster to not have to pick up an unfortunate amount of rule memorization and pages and pages of notes on how individual spells work. It can be pretty useful. Now, I will say in the series of videos, today we're just covering the overview. The next video we will be covering the rules of Dungeons & Dragons, and there are more than just what I have just said. Third video will be about making a character, and the fourth video will be about all the supporting things that are available in Dungeons & Dragons. So don't fear if I'm going too fast over some things, because we will be going back, and also acknowledging any comments that might lead to other further videos are also very much on the table. Now, the middleweight rules are a good baseline because it shows the kind of things that a person might expect in a role-playing game to resolve any question of, can my character do a thing? In this case, being proficient in something is a bonus, and it gets be a bigger bonus as your character gets more powerful. Your natural aptitude for something, represented by high attributes, has a great impact, possibly as much as one's proficiency might ever be. And sometimes the circumstances can be an influence, like hitting a foe who's behind cover might give a penalty to your attack, or maybe draw advantage or disadvantage, which we'll cover in the next video. A very nice little addition to 5th edition. And the last thing I brought up is high fantasy. And high fantasy is different from stock fantasy, or low fantasy, certainly. Low fantasy would be something like, say, the world of Conan, where most of your heroes carry weapons and wear armor and get by their bravado and guts and skills and grit. Magic is usually something to be feared and is often tuned into something unwholesome. So somebody who is a wizard might actually be decent, but an awful lot of your opponents who use magic are going to use some pretty nasty stuff. Middle of the road fantasy might be more like Tolkien, where wizards do exist, but most people who use magic are actually using lore and some primitive alchemy, things like that. True wizards are actually not even human, so real magic does exist, and there are magical monsters like Balrogs, but in the main, most everything that you deal with has a mundane component to it. There are things that are fantastical indeed, especially other races like dwarves and elves, halflings, monsters such as orcs that are absolutely a staple of fantasy, creatures like the Ents. That all works in middle fantasy. And yes, Dungeons & Dragons has all of that. Not so subtly. But in high fantasy, for almost any problem that you might have, there's a magical solution for it. And there's a decent chance that sometime during your career, you might find that magical solution. Trying to carry so much that even a couple of pack mules, which themselves have their own problems, couldn't fix? Well, a simple magical item called a portable hole, which is rare, but considering that you can fold it out on the floor, create a 10-foot deep, 10-foot round well, put whatever you want into it, then just lift up the side and fold it up again and stick it in your pocket, preserving all of the stuff until you unfold it to unpack, takes almost complete care of anything that you'll ever want to carry. Along with bags of holding, which are magical bags that look like normal bags but can hold vastly more than a standard bag could, and at the same weight as a lightly loaded bag. It takes care of that problem. Let alone the possibility of getting into a fight and getting grievously injured, somebody just coming along and going, fixed. Without magical healing, most adventuring doesn't make a lick of sense. Almost all adventurers would be horribly scarred or maimed before very long. Only the most successful or well-equipped ones have a chance. But with magical healing, possibilities of getting permanently injured are pretty slender, leading to a cinematic reality where your characters constantly throw themselves into danger and have almost no lasting ill effects, short of death, which even that isn't on the table in some tables. So, the high fantasy means that wizards are somebody that you could just walk down the street and bump into, and there are certainly powerful wizards who can do significant damage to an army with a few well-placed fireballs, and you live in a world where that is a possibility. That is the default setting for Dungeons & Dragons, and while people can change those dials and, move things up and down, you can move it up for really high magic in a game setting like Eberron. Or you could try to lower the settings so that you could comfortably play in, for example, Middle-earth, but it would require a bit of hacking to do that, because again, in Middle-earth you don't have wizards walking up every street, and the possibility of finding people with magical weapons in a town is unheard of. But again, the Dungeon Master, the name of the Game Master of Dungeons & Dragons, can change things a bit and use that robust set of rules to be able to play just the game they want to. So that covers, for the most part, the description of Dungeons and Dragons and kind of illuminates, for the sake of comparison, how Dungeons and Dragons features work in the main. But there are a few other things that you'd have to understand about Dungeons and Dragons to, really appreciate what the game does and the experience that it offers. For one thing, Dungeons and Dragons is quite abstract. While it may have rules that determine, yes, you succeed at this, yes, this is going to cost you so much, there are some things that it does try to, for lack of better words, simulate a reality of its own. There are some things that it just doesn't or can't. For instance, most combats will, without a game master diligently working to inflame the imaginations of the combatants, kind of feel like a video game. You have a weapon, you roll to attack. If you attack, you may do some damage, which is based on the weapon that you're using, and perhaps any, again, advantages that you have being very dexterous or very strong. And then you hop back and wait for your turn to come up again, in which case things might move up and attack you at the same time while you alternate blows. That's a D&D combat. However, for instance, you land a great blow. Maybe not a critical. You didn't roll a 20, but you landed a great blow. You can still roll minimum damage and do just as much as if you'd only grazed them by barely hitting their armor class. There's a bit of abstraction that you, as a game master, might have to really work to make this make sense to the players on how their roles actually imply to the reality of your game. And for some things, like the idea of a sliding scale of performance, for instance, Dungeons & Dragons is worried about a target number. If you hit that target number, you succeed. If you roll under that target number, you fail. It's a pass-fail system. But canny game masters will look at that and say, there's nuance to be had here, especially in the narration of how effective something was. If I absolutely crush a target number, I could succeed with aplomb. I could really look impressive and maybe even ring out some other bonus for doing so well. But that's wholly in the hands of the game master to abstractly reward or punish great or terrible rolls. There is a lot of holes, even as evolved as Dungeons & Dragons has become, that to make sense of the world and to add verisimilitude with the actual dice that are rolled and the results that come out, for the game master's narration skills to come to the fore and really try to put forth reality in a way that the players can still remain immersed in, seeing how the dice came out and seeing how the result ends up. Hit points themselves are a huge abstraction as well. Everybody, starting out at full hit points, it's assumed that they are in great shape, great spirits, ready to go. But what does 10 points of damage mean? Well, if you start out with, say, 12 hit points as a callow first-level adventurer, say a healthy fighter or a barbarian, then 10 points of damage is a crippling blow. You're badly injured, but at the same time, there's no game mechanic that says your character is at all impaired by this severe blow. There's no bleeding rules unless you have a special weapon or a special attack from a monster. There's no chance of breaking a limb or a bone. It's a cinematic rule that hit points, just how important it is that you're still upright and contributing to the story, it really doesn't have a direct impact on how deep of a wound it is or how much it's going to impact you. That's left up to the game master to narrate, the dungeon master. And if you have 100 hit points, say you're an advanced character, 10 points may not be that much. It might be something that you sidestepped, draining a little of your personal energy to avoid taking any actual physical damage, which is why magical healing can heal so much. Just just replenishing your personal reserves of energy. In 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, just to make a reference, they had something called bloodied, meaning that when you were past half of your hit points, you were starting to take real physical punishment, and you would be showing as wounds, bruising, bleeding, so on. Before that point, you're just dodging. You're maybe straining a little bit, but damage is very abstract and always has been in Dungeons and Dragons. This is both an advantage and a weakness. Some people have a hard time imagining what a hit point means in the scope of what your characters are experiencing, what they can do. And realistically, you just kind of have to remember it's just how important it is that your character is still upright to the overall part of the story. It's also a game that is much more forgiving than older versions of role-playing games were, where typically you run out of hit points and you die. There's a generous system that allows you to hang on, hoping for allies to come and save you once you have dropped to 0 hit points, which is kind of nice. I mean, if the characters are the important part of the story, their deaths should have some meaning, rather than just being a lucky blow that drops you to 0 hit points. But there are people who would rail against that as being just too much of a safety net. Players don't take threats seriously. Well, I can assure you, players can watch their characters die playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. There is still a lethality to the game. Characters can die suddenly and unpredictably, but it is harder, and you do have a little bit of a safety net. So the whole act of going out and adventuring, and especially if you have magical healing on your side, does make some sense. Your characters do have a charmed life with, trying to gain that experience. There are some things that make it likely that you will survive to that point. Of course, a lot of that can be changed by the experience of the game master, how vicious they want to be, how vicious the foes are that you're facing, and it can be very challenging, very deadly. It's all up to how your game runs, and sometimes how your dice treat you too, which is almost always an issue in a role-playing game. If your dice absolutely hate you, then you're in for a long session, or possibly a very short session if your character dies. Now, another thing about Dungeons & Dragons that is fairly notorious is that with Dungeons & Dragons, there's a huge market that's built up around stuff for Dungeons & Dragons. And we'll talk about that in a future video. But with Dungeons & Dragons, there are enough rules in the game that you could run the game like a tactical war game, complete with miniatures, maybe even 3D terrain, and all the whistles and bells. The rules are solid enough that you could absolutely run a war game out of a Dungeons & Dragons experience, setting up an encounter to be a challenge to be overcome with positioning, tactics, strategy, force of your character, etc. So it does offer that for people who enjoy that kind of conflict, that kind of challenge. The general feeling, though, of most of the products that come out from Wizards of the Coast, the official stuff, is that your characters are the prime characters in a story. And the story unfolds as your character goes through. It is much less about, a dungeon crawl to a point. Although they do have dungeon crawls to the point of, just trying to overcome it. Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is about a notorious dungeon called Undermountain. Specifically, you could tie in story beats to that dungeon itself, but you can also just say your adventurers are gritting their teeth and out to prove that they can do it, getting fabulously wealthy and powerful in the process. And that's just as valid. That harkens back to an older style of play, but it still works today, which is kind of cool. Those connections are still solid. Ultimately, Dungeons & Dragons does have elements of narrative play, but it does a pretty good job of simulating in general, giving the Dungeon Master a lot of tools for basically determining how things are going to go in their game, setting benchmarks the players can appreciate and rely on, probabilities that the players can understand the risks of, but still leaving openness for surprises. there's a lot of evolution, as I've said. A lot of voices have been added to Dungeons & Dragons since 1974. This current version is a culmination of the voices not only of the game designers who've had the branding of Dungeons & Dragons in their grasp, but an awful lot of players over the years who've contributed thoughts and ideas and have built the game up to where it is today, every bit as much as the lead designers and technicians who have had the hand in the changes of Dungeons & Dragons. And it will continue to evolve. It would be foolish to think that this is the final edition, because even Wizards of the Coast says that it's not going to be the final edition. But what can we decide that Dungeons & Dragons has led us to? Some of the inescapable things. Even though you can tinker under the hood, and you can change up things and still use the same system, Dungeons & Dragons is a game of fantasy, where you have swords and sorcery together, meeting and mingling in lots of interesting ways, with characters depending on others bringing certain skills to the fore so that the group can be balanced and have the best chance of success. Or completely unbalanced and create chaos and havoc, but that could be fun too. It is a game about classes, and by knowing what class you have, knowing the role that you're intending to play, there's also a certain amount of tinkering and figuring out the best balance of certain classes, certain magical items, certain abilities, and making them stack up in a way that makes the character that you ultimately want to see. There is a rush for competition for who can make the best, the most damage dealing, the most hit points, the hardest to hit, etc., etc. Ultimately, Dungeons & Dragons does lend itself to that. That is the game that they have come up with, and many, many very well-researched, well-thought-out ideas that go out as some of the perfect builds that can wreck the game. Seems to be a common theme that players just really do focus on, is not necessarily how do I tell this story, but how do I end up with a level 17 fighter, second level warlock, first level rogue that absolutely can destroy any opponent in a single round. There's people who figure that out. And for the people who love that kind of constructed alternate reality in fantasy, Dungeons & Dragons is a solid game. The strengths of Dungeons & Dragons are its universality, in that you can almost always find a Dungeons & Dragons game somewhere in your area. And if you can't, there's a huge, huge crowd of people playing it online. Matter of fact, Wizards of the Coast has D&D Beyond, which allows you to hook up with people from all over the globe. So there's almost always a game available if you just go out and look for it. But it's also very simple to find all of the materials. Most of the big box retailers have the Dungeons & Dragons core books at one time or another, and online they can be had for a relatively small amount. Considering their retail cost is $50 a piece, it's not uncommon to go onto something like Amazon and find them for half of that. And if you buy it on the secondhand market, you can find them even cheaper. So Dungeons & Dragons is pretty darn accessible, and that is one of its great strengths. If somebody is a gamer, there's a good chance they know how to play Dungeons & Dragons. And even if they know an earlier version than the 5th edition, it doesn't take a tremendous amount to bring somebody up to speed, so that they can also play in your game of Dungeons & Dragons. They may not like it as much as the one they feel nostalgic for, but they can at least understand it and proceed. So that is a huge advantage that D&D has. Also, the massive amount of media and things that are available for it. It is a welcoming game because there's just so much. At any given time, you could spend weeks looking through YouTube for all sorts of videos on strategies and lore and what's coming up. There's just so much. It's very, very, very easy to expose yourself to Dungeons & Dragons. And once you get into it, there's a lot of material. It's pretty compelling. We'll go over all of that in future videos, but Dungeons & Dragons is incredibly well supported. It has a thriving community. It's not going anywhere. So you will have many opportunities to play. And really, is it a good game? Yeah, it's a pretty good game. I mean, you can have your own personal issues, and certainly I do. But as far as being able to tell a story competently, to be able to have thrilling adventures and encounters that will absolutely challenge your players, yeah, it's got that. As far as role playability, well, Dungeons and Dragons kind of set the standards for you can roleplay as much as you want to. If the dungeon master says that your roleplay is all that you need for interacting with other or other NPCs and the other player characters, then you don't need to roll dice all the time. You could just say, "Wow, that was really well done." Oh, yeah, of course he agrees with you, rather than having to make okay. Wow, you said all this. Now we'll go ahead and roll for your deception. Oh, you rolled a 1. Even though you told that really, really well, he doesn't believe you and you still failed. This is all things that dungeon masters can do. It's in their toolbox. But what all is in that toolbox? We're going to cover some of that in the next video. But this is the introduction to D&D. Hopefully, you found this to be accurate and compelling. If you ever find anybody who wants to know what is this 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons all about, well, here's your video. And hopefully they enjoy it and go on to learn more about this very interesting game. However, the well for Dungeons and Dragons is seemingly infinite, but on this channel it's just going to be 4 videos primarily explaining 5th edition and its place, putting things into place to help you to use it and enjoy it. After that, we'll be covering other games because there are a lot of role-playing games out there, all of which beg to be highlighted, beg to have their own turn and their own videos. So expect that on the Dungeon Tutor. I did enjoy this video. Thank you for joining me. I do hope to see you again because, let's face it, that's why I do this. So it is my hope that you come back for more. To do that, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification button. You know, the usual YouTube stuff. And then we will, because I'll keep putting out more videos, certainly. That's why I do this. So I hope that between then and now, that you, yes, you, have a chance to roll some dice, to play some games, to have some fun. But stay safe out there. I'm the Dungeon Tutor, and it's been my pleasure for this lesson. Until that next time, my friends, don't forget to leave comments below explaining what you agree with, what maybe I glossed over, what you didn't agree with, and maybe that'll even get you a video of your own in the not too distant future. So, until that next time, my friends, farewell.